Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everyone. On behalf of the European Public Health Association and its director Charlotte Marchandise, who cannot join us today, unfortunately, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us in the UFA Stands Up for Science webinar. Today, the 7th of March 2025, marks the end of the second Trump administration's 6 weeks honeymoon. 6 weeks that have seen unprecedented political damage to science, freezing funding, taking websites, databases, and organizations offline, censoring language and blocking collaborations. The administration is dismantling the sources of data needed to control infectious diseases and monitor climate change. This is not just impacting US citizens, but leaving millions of people worldwide without hope for a healthier future. And this further is undermining our trust in the evidence that we need for life-saving public policies. But of course, this is not a recent and exclusively American phenomenon. In UFA, the Policy and Politics section in particular, we have been facilitating research into the relationship between European political systems, populist radical right and health in various forms for almost a decade. And besides academic institutions, also health NGOs and civil society organizations are at risk of regulations to considerably diminish the voice and representation of public health interests for political decision-making. So let me share my slides and discuss the aims for today. So today, we would like to express our solidarity and support for US health academics and public health institutions. We want to raise awareness of the huge worldwide impacts on science and health, and we want to share thoughts and experiences on what we in Europe can do to build in safeguards for evidence-based health laws and policies. So the program for today is as follows, and our distinguished speakers all have a track record of taking courage and pride in studying politics and health, advising governments and the public as well as international organizations, and speaking up publicly and taking moral leadership on adversarial politics to science and health. So our first speaker is Professor Scott Greer, and he will talk to us about US government attacks on science as a transnational conflict. Secondly, we welcome Professor Christian Yates, who will talk about how to support US science while safeguarding European science with a call to action. And then our third and final speaker, Professor Martin McKee, about how Europe stands up for science and what must we do now. I'm asking you to save your questions, comments, and suggestions in the chat, where we have some dedicated time that will be moderated by Damir Ivankovic, who is the current Vice President of the UFA Public Health Policy and Politics section. And we will end with 3 key messages and the closing. So our first speaker, Professor Scott Greer, is a professor of health management and policy, global public health and political science in the University of Michigan in the US. He is also a senior expert advisor on health governance to the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies. And as an American political scientist, he has made a career of studying European health policies and comparative health politics across the world. At an astonishing rate, he wrote and co-authored many books and articles, among which The Populist Radical Right in Health, National Policies and Global Trends, together with Michel Falkenbach. It's a privilege to have you here, sharing your experiences and professional reflections on the current events. The floor is yours, Scott.
And thank you all for having me. I would say it's a pleasure to be here, but the reason for the gathering isn't that much fun. It's hard to talk about what's going on in the United States right now without sounding like a lunatic. People still, many including in the United States, look at me strangely when I explain that as a matter of recorded fact, A 19-year-old who goes by the LinkedIn handle of Big Balls has stolen the financial data of 400 million people. Or our president, in a State of the Union speech, confused transgenic mice versus transgender mice and pretended that the federal government was spending millions of dollars on sex changes for mice. Or the Department of Defense has removed one airplane called the Enola Gay from its online website because the word gay appears in the name of the Enola Gay. For those of you who are World War II history buffs, you might know that Enola Gay was the airplane that dropped the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. Probably not anybody's first concept of wokeness. We have a South African billionaire giving Nazi salutes while firing tens of thousands of civil servants with no constitutional or legal authority, and the government is overtly mocking the judges who attempt to discern simply who is actually giving the orders that are causing people to lose their jobs and essential services to be shut down. It's a very strange situation. And if you step back from the confusion in this gallery of strange characters, from Elon Musk to Big Balls to the Enola Gay, you also find some really perplexing things. For example, what has happened to the incredibly powerful, famously vicious American lobbies that have been able to stymie change and shape politics in so many ways? Or how is any of this being done by a president who is essentially the most unpopular in the history of polling and has extraordinarily thin legislative margins? Well, if we narrow down to what's going on in science, it's an extraordinary record of bad events so far. Marleen already alluded to them. I'm happy to talk about them, but we've had pauses on pavements. We've had the unconstitutional destruction of the US Agency for International Development. We've had an essential ceasing of PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief in Africa, which, put it this way, there's a PEPFAR deaths tracker, which is running at about 20,000 people have died as a result of this decision already. We've had the departure from the WHO and the end of cooperation with WHO. And we've handed over the entire health department to essentially anti-vaccine quacks and grifters who are already deeply interfering with our H5N1, that's the avian flu pandemic response, and who are up to all sorts of mischief in a vaccine and medicines approval system that was always built on the premise of good faith among the government. I won't even get into topics like climate change, where the United States government has shifted from being a helpful, if eccentric actor much of the time to being an absolutely, resolutely negative actor. Now, where does science fit in this? As a political scientist, my tendency is to say that all of this is downstream from the really fundamental question of whether the United States is a democracy. A democracy, in the most simple definition, is a political system in which political parties lose elections and leave office. By that definition, all you can say is that it's a hypothesis that the United States is a democracy, and it's one we're not likely to have a chance to test until November 2028 and January 2029. You can't assume that the United States fulfills the minimal definition for a liberal democracy. That sort of seems more important even than something as important as PEPFAR, no? Because the likes of PEPFAR are programs that only exist in democracies. But still, science is central, and it's for two reasons. The first is that they're coming for us. It's not an accident that right after foreign aid, you saw an attack on health research at the National Institutes of Health, on broader science at the National Science Foundations, and a set of really, really devastating attacks on universities as a whole, ranging from policing free speech to attempting to get our students thrown out, to some technical work on how grants are costed out that would essentially destroy most of the leading research institutions. The University of Michigan, where I happen to work, has had $18 million illegally withheld so far. Harvard, just through the luck of the draw, has had $80 million withheld. So you're talking about damage to any American university you can think of that would pretty much end their research activity within about 30 weeks. That's a big deal. Secondly, it's because science is actually something that's popular. It's really, really hard to explain things like the economic costing, indirect benefits, full language of F&E that we have to employ people to understand. But fundamentally, they're firing cancer researchers. They're ending drug trials. They're leaving people enrolled in drug trials with implantable medical devices that not only have we quit monitoring, we're not even going to take them out if they don't work. I hope you enjoy your new implantable that was put in as an experiment. So this is stuff that actually lands with the public. When you look at the enormous range and diversity of things that the Trump-Musk administration are doing, and I have to call it the Trump-Musk administration because if you empower somebody to essentially be the chief operating officer of the government, that person's name has to be associated with it, is unpopular. And it's also going to be the wedge that could potentially start to break this extraordinary regime that has been constructed on the fly. Now, in thinking about it, I'd say three things, and I think this is teeing up my fellow speakers relatively well. The first is that I might have begun by talking about big balls, but don't exoticize the United States too much. It's certainly a country that in many ways doesn't resemble other countries, especially in the European Union. There's no equivalent to its legacy of chattel slavery, for example. But there's a lot of things going on in every liberal democracy in the world that are really, really serious cause for concern. I could tell equally strange stories about many European countries. They've often been saved simply by electoral rules. In the United States, if you were mad about inflation in 2024, the only way you had to show your irritation with inflation under the Democrats was to vote for a fascist party. And voters who are not good at reliably thinking about democracy did that in just enough numbers to create the situation we see now. But don't think about this as a country on country thing. Think of it as a transnational civil conflict. The second point is don't ever overstate what we can predict. One of the definitions of a crisis is simply that you have no idea which of many, many options could come out. You could see the United States falling into durable authoritarianism or a sort of hybrid situation in which half the states are essentially autocracies and then their support use that power at the federal level to support themselves. You could also imagine that there's going to be a tremendous backlash that could lead us to a new democratic founding, a much better American democracy, because heaven knows there was a lot of problems with the one that ended about a month ago. Now, what could Europe do? Well, there's an obvious European strategy, which is simply try to take advantage of the opportunity to pick up where the United States has left an open chair at relatively low cost. I think it's quite likely that Europe becomes the dominant player in the World Health Organization simply because it's the only group of rich countries that actually have an agenda that supports the WHO and who care. You could imagine Europe taking on a great deal of scientific leadership. I'm just noticed that it was just sent information that a French university, Aix-Marseille, is offering $15 million to support American researchers. So hire the researchers, attract the students, attract the associated company labs, rationalize the visas, invest in the research. Now, the only thing I'd say to this is that it takes quite a lot of money, right? The NIH alone spends $53 billion. That's 2 years of Europe's entire research expenditure by the European Union under Horizon. So if you're going to try and take over doing what the United States was doing, it's going to cost a lot of money. The second thing, I remember mentioning that the absence of the backlash is one of the great puzzles. What happened to all these great American lobbies and all these famously disputatious Americans? Well, there's a lot of different people who are essentially having a lot of different collective action problems. And any ability to take a stance, show some heroism, make more powerful Americans think that they're not alone and actually that their interests are in doing something can be helpful. And the third one is learn. Don't underestimate just how important Hungary is in the thinking of the people around Donald Trump. They want to learn from Viktor Orban. And don't think that some of the innovations in American governance over the last 2 months are not attracting attention around Europe. So seeing as that it's a transnational civil war in many ways, make sure that you learn what you can from what's being done in the United States, because people who are deeply opposed to science and public health are definitely doing so. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Scott, for sharing your first-hand experiences. Quite a devastating picture, and sometimes maybe even worse than I already observed, but also drawing the parallels to Europe and the realities that we are facing here as well. So it's a warning that we should brace for years of political instability and, yeah, maybe even worse. But while we are, as Europeans, not positioned to influence or change American politics, we can turn to see what are our own political dynamics and capacities to make a local and global change. So let me introduce the next speaker. Yes. So I welcome Professor Christian Kit Yates. He is a professor of mathematical biology and public engagement and director of the Center for Mathematical Biology at the University of Bath in the UK. And in addition to being a brilliant mathematical biology professor, Kit Yates also acts as a widening participation, outreach and engagement officer in numerous public media appearances in the UK, for which he won many prizes and awards. Among his publications are two popular science books, The Maths of Life and Death in 2019, that has been translated into 25 languages, and How to Expect the Unexpected in 2023. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here and learn from your experiences. The floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marleen. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this really important event. It was great to get Scott's perspective just then, and thank you for speaking so wonderfully, Scott. And I hope that I can build on that. So, of course, yeah, the United States is currently witnessing an unprecedented assault on its scientists and its scientific institutions, which is largely driven by populist agendas, which are prioritizing ideology over evidence. And it's my view that these attacks threaten the very foundations of evidence-based policymaking and scientific progress. United States scientific institutions, which for so long have been the pioneers of global scientific research, are now suffering under an atmosphere in which political interference threatens to erode trust, funding is being slashed, and intellectual freedom is being curtailed. I think I won't go over all the details, but recent weeks we've seen some alarming developments, the chaotic freezing of research grants and research funding, this push for institutional neutrality that risks silencing scientists, and growing influence of figures like RFK Jr., who continue to spread anti-vaccine misinformation. And at the same time, of course, we've got Elon Musk's growing influence over public discourse, which has raised concerns about the amplification of disinformation, in particular, of course, through social media, which is threatening to undermine science and scientists and indeed scientific institutions. So for us as European scientists watching this disaster unfold one step removed, it's important that we don't stand by and watch, but instead that we react to support our US colleagues. We also have to recognise the warning signs within our own borders and act swiftly to safeguard our own scientific institutions from a similar fate. So these are going to be the two main topics that I'll discuss: supporting US colleagues and the United States, and safeguarding our own science. So many US scientists, I believe, fear that speaking out against the current regime could jeopardize their careers or their funding or even their personal safety. Certainly had people message me recently saying thank you for speaking out, but I don't feel able to myself. Scientific colleagues from around the globe have to come together, come to their aid to speak out against this political interference in science, advocating for our own scientific institutions to defend scientific integrity and offering potentially research opportunities to those facing suppression. It's more important now than ever that non-US scientists start to engage with policymakers in their own countries to promote evidence-based policies globally, if not for the sake of the United States and our colleagues, then for our own sake, to safeguard our own future scientific endeavours against the creeping rise of populism. So what can we do to support our US colleagues? Well, we know that science thrives on collaboration and openness, and an era where political forces are increasingly seeking to distort or suppress or to co-opt scientific knowledge for ideological purposes, we as a global scientific community have to recognize that staying silent in the face of these challenges is no longer an option. Non-US scientists who are likely to be a bit further removed from the immediate repercussions of speaking out have to amplify the suppressed voices of US scientists and advocate for scientific integrity on their behalf. I think firstly that the non-US scientific community has to be vocal in calling out policies that undermine scientific integrity in the US and beyond. Institutions like the Royal Society here in the UK should be using their platforms to challenge misinformation and to advocate for the protection of US scientists who are facing political retribution. Another tangible step that European scientific institutions might take is to offer fellowships and other research opportunities to US scientists who find themselves marginalised or unable to work freely due to political interference. And as Scott said, it's good to hear that Marseille has been taking a lead on this. Many countries in Europe already benefit from a strong tradition of scientific collaboration with the United States, and expanding this through targeted programs for people facing suppression would not only help individual researchers, but also strengthen international scientific resilience. Obviously, the recent freezing of grants underscores the need for scientific opportunities for those who are at risk in the US. And from a purely selfish point of view, Europe could view this as an opportunity to attract some of the best and brightest minds who are experiencing marginalization in the US at the moment. I think a key aspect of recent political attacks on science is the deliberate spread of dis or misinformation. Figures like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as I've already mentioned, have brought anti-vax rhetoric into the mainstream, while, of course, Elon Musk's influence over online discourse has amplified things like climate denial, conspiracy theories, hate speech, to name but a few. So non-US scientists should be taking an active role in trying to counter these narratives through public engagement, through media outreach and digital literacy campaigns. Many European governments still do currently maintain stronger institutional safeguards for scientific integrity than the current US regime. It's not hard to say in many cases. European and other non-US scientists, though, should lobby policymakers to advocate for pro-science policies at the international level, including when negotiating with the United States. Obviously, attacks on science in one country will have ripple effects elsewhere, so the global scientific community has to work closely with our US counterparts, not just in research, but also in activism, which is why this webinar is so important, taking part in this Stand Up for Science programme. This could involve things like providing legal aid to persecuted scientists or forming transatlantic coalitions to try and defend academic freedom. We also have to look within ourselves and try to understand how Europe can safeguard itself against the populist right. So we've seen with the rise in populism in many of its countries that Europe isn't immune to the growing influence of populism and its disdain for scientific expertise. We're already experiencing the emergence of anti-science rhetoric in the public discourse, particularly around climate change policies, around vaccines and social policy. Some media outlets even are complicit and are keen to amplify climate change skepticism, for example, while politicians, certainly here in the UK, have questioned things like our net zero commitments, framing them as some sort of elitist agenda rather than some science-backed policy. This trend has also led to attacks on academic freedom. Universities have faced increasing pressure from populist politicians. Meanwhile, right-wing media outlets continue to provide a platform for climate skepticism and other forms of scientific misinformation, influencing the public opinion and indeed policymaking in ways which will almost certainly be detrimental to Europe's scientific future. So we need to take action to safeguard European science as well. To prevent the erosion of scientific integrity and to protect vital scientific research, Europe has to take decisive action to insulate its research institutions and the academic freedom of its scientists from the influence of populist anti-science politics. So we need to enact strong legal protections for scientific institutions in order to guarantee their independence. We need to enforce legislation which can prevent political figures from defunding or censoring research that doesn't align with their ideological interests in the way that we've seen recently happening in the US. I think another thing, as a professor of public engagement, I think public engagement with science has to be strengthened in order to counter misinformation and to emphasize the value of unbiased scientific research. Scientists and institutions have to communicate their work more effectively, trying to use accessible language, trying to use a diverse range of media, social media platforms to reach the broadest audiences possible. And I hope that by fostering a society that values and understands science, we can build resilience against populist attempts to delegitimize our research. I think related to that, mobilizing public support for science is potentially a critical line of defense. When citizens understand the importance of scientific research and its direct impact on their lives, whether that's through medical achievements, technological innovations, or climate resilience, I think they're then more likely to demand that those things are protected. I think safeguarding evidence-based policymaking is going to be another essential protection that we need to work towards. Commitment to this would involve embedding scientific advisors throughout our governments, with their recommendations given real weight in decision making, not just paid lip service to. And at the same time, I think we need universities and research institutions to adopt much stronger protections for academic freedom. Researchers have to be able to work without fear of political retribution or ideological attacks, particularly in fields that are often targeted by populists like climate science, like epidemiology and social policy. Attacks on science have to be countered quickly and decisively. And we as the scientific community have to be proactive in calling out attempts to distort research or to undermine expert consensus. Because if information is allowed to spread unchecked, it can take root in the public consciousness and indeed in the mind of policymakers, which makes it harder to correct for later. So just to finish, it's time for European science to safeguard itself. The challenges currently faced by the US scientific community serve as a really stark reminder of the fragility of scientific institutions in the face of political populism. Europe is currently standing at a crossroads. By taking proactive measures now, we can strengthen our scientific landscape against similar threats to those being carried out in the United States. But if we fail to act, we risk witnessing the same erosions of scientific credibility, institutional independence that are afflicting the United States. I think we need to act now to ensure the preservation and protection of European science against the rise of populism. That's where I'll finish. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kit. And especially for pointing out the social responsibility of science, right? We really need to get out of our comfort zones and discuss, build capacity, explain the impacts that we have been creating for decades on health, and therefore, hopefully build the legitimate basis for continuing our work. So thank you very much. And now I'd like to hand over to Martin McKee. Let me share my screen for a moment. Yes, so Martin McKee, he's a professor of European Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in the UK, past president of the British Medical Association and the European Public Health Association. And Professor Martin McKee has been a long-time worldwide champion on translating his tremendous medical academic achievements and his omnipresent advocacy into high-level advice to governments and international organizations. He co-established the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies, and he's been elected into the UK Academy of Medical Sciences and the US National Academy of Medicine. He wrote extensively on the impacts of Brexit on health, campaigning for healthier in the EU. And I hereby hand over to you, Martin.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Marleen. If you could just move on to the next slide.
Yes.
And so Kit has already, I just go back one. Yeah, Kit has already described very eloquently the ways in which science is under siege today. We've seen how we've heard from Scott, how the Trump administration, the Trump-Musk administration, has launched an unprecedented assault on scientific integrity, cutting funding for critical research, censoring climate data, undermining public health institutions, and replacing scientific advisors with political loyalists. The government agencies that we looked to for their evidence-based policy are being stripped of their independence. And as we've heard, scientists who speak out face intimidation and career-threatening consequences. So whether it's environmental protections or pandemic response, decisions are being made that are based on ideology rather than evidence, and in pursuit of private interest rather than the public good, with disastrous consequences for Americans and the wider world. Next slide, please. But this isn't the first time we have seen such an assault on knowledge. In Europe, we witnessed this before, most infamously in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, German science, which had been a global leader, was decimated by the Nazi regime as it purged Jewish scientists, distorted research to fit its racial ideology, and suppressed findings that did not align with its political goals. Now, I've worked in the countries of the former Soviet Union since the political transition at the end of the 1980s, and I've written a lot about the legacy of Soviet science. I think back to the periodic table, which we all learnt at school, created by Dmitry Mendeleev. Pavlov, with his dog, discovered conditioned reflexes, and we in public health still use a test named after Andrei Kolmogorov, who made major contributions to probability theory. And then there was Andrei Markov with his famous chains. But the institutions that gave rise to this thinking were swept aside in 1928. Stalin crushed independent scientific inquiry, replacing rigorous research with ideological dogma. The most infamous example was Lysenkoism, which set Soviet agriculture back by decades and contributed to widespread famine. So both of these European regimes showed us the devastating consequences when governments seek to control and manipulate science rather than allowing it to inform policy and progress. So it's because of our experiences here in Europe that we have a special responsibility to heed these historical warnings. The attack on science is not just an American problem, it's a global threat. And if we don't stand up to it now, we risk seeing similar forces gaining traction here, undermining decades of progress in evidence-based policy making. We have to resist, and we must do so decisively. And I'm going to argue that there are 7 things we can do. Next slide, please. But before I do so, I want to acknowledge my colleague Christina Pagel, who, like Kit and myself, are members of Independent Sage in the UK, and I strongly recommend that you read her Substack articles where she develops these ideas in much more detail, and especially the one in which she describes how Americans are fighting back. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we need to do is to recognize that science does not exist in a vacuum. It thrives within societies that value truth and rational discourse and evidence-based policy making. Scientists, as Kit has said, must become vocal advocates for the role of research in shaping policy and improving lives. And this means engaging much more actively with policymakers, the media, and the public. We're especially proud of what we did in Independent Sage to communicate science during the pandemic. We have to move beyond traditional academic publishing, and I say move beyond. I'm a former editor of the European Journal of Public Health, so obviously I hope that you'll all continue to publish in academic journals. But we also have to step into the public arena. We need to write op-eds, we need to give interviews, and participate in public debates to counter disinformation and highlight the importance of scientific integrity. Science communication has to be accessible, clear, and compelling. We must not shy away from explaining complex issues in ways that resonate with the general public. And here I pay tribute to Kit as a master in doing this. Next slide, please. So one of the greatest threats to science today is the erosion of institutional independence. Governments and political actors are increasingly seeking to dictate research priorities based on their ideological preferences rather than on scientific merit. In the United States and in some other countries, we are seeing how funding is being directed away from critical areas like climate change and public health and the social sciences, while politically favored topics receive disproportionate support. So European scientists must actively lobby for the independence of research institutions and to demand transparency in funding allocation. We must work through organisations like the European Research Council, Academia Europaea, national academies, scientific bodies, to establish stronger safeguards that protect academic freedom. Next slide, please. We've already heard that the attack on science is not confined to any one country. It's a global phenomenon, and as such, it needs a global united response. Scientists across Europe must come together, strengthening networks of collaboration and solidarity. When researchers in one country face political repression or funding restrictions, we must all speak out in their defence. We must establish legal support funds and advocacy groups to protect at-risk scientists. And we need stronger international agreements that enshrine scientific independence and protect researchers from political interference. Next slide, please. Now, once again, we are seeing censorship of research findings that contradict political narratives. Whether it is data on climate change or pandemic preparedness or human rights, scientific evidence is being dismissed, downplayed, or simply suppressed. To counter this, we have to promote open access publishing and ensure that vital research remains publicly available. Scientists must also forge alliances with investigative journalists and legal experts to expose attempts to manipulate or conceal findings. We must all, as individuals and as organisations, speak out in support of protecting whistleblowers who reveal instances of scientific censorship. And if you haven't seen it, do read our joint editorial by UFA and our journal on why we will not be intimidated by those who seek to control the words that we use. Next slide, please. Public trust in science is fundamental to its survival. We have to work tirelessly to counter disinformation and conspiracy theories that seek to discredit scientific rationale and consensus. We need many more initiatives that encourage critical thinking. And here I pay tribute to Finland's experience in building this into the teaching in schools. It's an example that we can all learn from. Public engagement campaigns like the work we did in Independent Sage, citizen science projects in partnership with educators can help to bridge the gap between researchers and societies. When people understand science and see the benefits to their daily lives, which are all around them, they're more likely to defend it against political attacks. Next slide, please. Scientists can't remain passive observers in the political landscape. It's a myth to think they can. While we may prefer to stay in our labs and on our research institutions, in the comfort of those facilities, we cannot possibly ignore seeing what's happening in Washington, the fact that political decisions shape the future of our work. So we have to encourage scientists to take on advisory roles in government. It's hard work, many of us do it, but it's a lot of work, but we have to do it. In some cases, to run for political office, but certainly to participate in the policymaking process. Scientific organisations need to establish dedicated advocacy groups to engage with policymakers and to push for evidence-based legislation, not to remain silent. We saw in the United Kingdom the abject failure of scientific leadership to speak out against Brexit, for example. And we must encourage everyone to vote for leaders who respect science while standing against those who want to undermine it. And that's really a civic duty. Next slide, please. Getting close to the end. History offers us many valuable lessons on how to resist oppression. Whether it's the scientific community's defiance of authoritarian regimes in the past, to contemporary movements that are defending press freedom and civil rights, we can draw inspiration and we can learn from those strategies. Legal challenges, mass mobilizations, and sustained advocacy have been successful in curbing political overreach before. We as scientists have to take similar steps, whether through organized protests or lawsuits, as our American colleagues are doing, or international appeals when we are faced with unjust suppression. The attack on science is an attack on democracy, progress, and the very foundations of modern civilization. But we're not powerless. Through our advocacy, our solidarity, our education, and our political engagement, we can defend the integrity of research and ensure that science remains a force for good in society. Now is the time to act. We have to be proactive, we have to be fearless and unwavering in our commitment to truth and knowledge. So I plead to you to stand together as scientists, as Europeans, and as defenders of reason against the forces that seek to undermine it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Martin, for this very clear and engaging path to public and political influence and change. So taking a stand in our everyday practice, building on history and expanding alliances, just starting with our own non-academic partners, seems a path that we can all take and build from. And I'd like to take you to some key messages that we would like to draw from this webinar. And the first one being, so the political attacks on science have become a transnational phenomenon with lines of conflict running through rather than between countries, such as Hungary, Austria, Italy, France, the Netherlands, and the UK. The second key message we want to bring is that European governments have the capacity to put in place strong institutional safeguards to protect scientific integrity, independent funding, and evidence-informed laws and policies. And the third one, we think Europe must step up to fill the gap left by the US withdrawal from science and global aid. And doing so will strengthen Europeans' voice in the world, its economies, and its soft power for global diplomacy and collaboration. So, when we come close to the end, today marks the day we stand up for science, joining our American colleagues as they march in protest in Washington, D.C. and many other American cities. It is when we say unequivocally that we stand in solidarity with US-based scientists and affected communities worldwide. European countries, individually and collectively through the EU, can and must safeguard scientific norms, resources and infrastructure at a global scale. We must work together to promote a healthy workforce, innovation, competitiveness, and a fair redistribution of health risks and benefits. Working with global, continental and national public health associations, UFA organizes and leverages its ability to convene the academic community in defense of public health values and to uphold evidence and education as the building blocks of civilization. And with these words, we are approaching the end of the webinar, but not without a heartfelt thank you to all our distinguished speakers, Professor Scott Greer, Kit Yates, Martin McKee, not just for your talks today, but for the tireless work in exposing often hidden political risks and damages to health and directing us to political leverage points for change. I thank you for joining us today and in our ambitions to expand the academic movement into a social movement. And a final thank you to UFA for building the bridges between our academic community, public health professionals, and politicians at various levels. This webinar has been recorded. We will be publishing it on our YouTube channel. Please follow us on the socials while we organize follow-up events in the European Public Health Week in May and our annual European Public Health Conference this year in Finland. Thank you very much for your attention and your participation, and we hope to see you at the next event. Thank you.
Bye.